Hi everyone, welcome to another Band 6 Bootcamp with the toughest 10. Today we're going to be working on business studies. I'm really excited to help you guys with business studies. I did get a Band 6 in business studies. I think I'll offer some pretty helpful tips for you guys to really smash these one out of the park. Yeah.
Hey everyone, my name is Emily. I also got a Band 6 in Business Studies, and I'd say it definitely was my favorite subject in high school. So I'm really excited to go through the toughest 10 questions with you guys. And if you can tackle these questions, I reckon you can tackle any question that you're going to get in the HSC. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, starting off with number 10, this is going to be sort of the easiest question out of our toughest 10. So it's a multiple choice and it's coming from the 2012 paper. It's question 10 from the finance topic. So it asks us, which of the following groups would suffer the worst financial impact as a result of an increase in the value of the Australian dollar? Caitlin, do you want to take us through this question?
Yes, I'd love to. So I tend to with exchange rates, because we're working with exchange rates here. It tends to be something quite difficult for me. I wasn't the best at the sort of finance section of it. I was a bit more of like an operations head. That was me. But anyway, so of course we've got to know with business studies. I like to just start out by saying you have to know what area of the syllabus that you're working in. So we're working in global financial management, and we're specifically looking at exchange rates. So essentially, I just like to have the idea in my head. First of all, we just have to understand like an exchange rate. So I like to think of it. Honestly, I just try to memorize exchange rate things. But when the Australian dollar increases, it's good for Australians because Australians can buy more overseas and it's cheaper for them. However, when the Australian dollar increases, other people, so non-Australians or any international buyers, don't like it because in comparison, their dollar is weaker, and so they're not going to be as willing to spend in AUD. Anyway, but let's go through each of these and let's see why it is or is not correct. So we have Japanese shareholders of an Australian bank. Yes, they might struggle a little bit here, but it's not going to be super, I wouldn't say it's the worst financial impact. And then we have B, Australian producers selling wine to New Zealand. What I said before about international buyers, they would suffer a lot. It becomes more expensive for those purchasing in New Zealand. So Australian producers, their sales will actually decrease because their buyers are more unwilling to buy. So it could be B. And then we also have C, Australian car makers purchasing inputs from Italy. What I said at the beginning, Australian purchasing power actually increases. So it's actually better for Australian car makers. So we can rule out C. And then we also have D, American travel agents organizing for Australians. So again, same as C, this is no. If the Australians are the one buying things overseas, they again have a greater purchasing power. And so the other currencies will become cheaper. And so Australian people would actually want to go buy overseas and go overseas. So from all of those, we can rule that the answer is B, Australian producers selling wine to New Zealand. But Emily, is there anything else that I didn't cover that you might wanted to add to this?
I think you covered it pretty well. It's the same way I'd approach it. But for everyone, I'd say exchange rates can be quite a difficult topic. I know a lot of people in my high school also struggled with that. So I'd recommend that you really understand the relationship sort of between the dollar either appreciating and depreciating, and then the supply and demand for Australians and international buyers, because ultimately that's what got us through this question. And I think the wording here is a little bit tricky, like Australian producers. Well, like you were saying, Australians would be happy that the dollar went up, but producers wouldn't be happy because international buyers would stop buying. So, yeah, I think the best way that you're going to be able to tackle this question is if you're really on top of your syllabus and you understand exchange rates fully. So, I think that's something to keep in mind when you're studying.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so let's get to the ninth toughest question. It's another multiple choice question from the 2021 HSC, and it's question 15 from the human resources topic. So we're given a table and it says a food delivery business made a recent change to their human resource management strategy with the following results. So we've got indicator on the left, we have absenteeism, deliveries per driver, number of accidents, and worker satisfaction. And then we've got the change on the right. So absenteeism has decreased, deliveries have increased, accidents have increased by 100%. So automatically that's sticking out to me. And then we can see worker satisfaction has also decreased. So we've got like quite a lot going on in this question. And then it says, which human resource strategy is most likely to have resulted in the changes? So we have A, increase in work health and safety training, B, the reduced use of staff performance reviews, C, a move from autocratic to a democratic leadership style, and D, move from a fixed salary to pay based on individual deliveries. Okay, so I feel like this question is quite tough because you've got that table and there's kind of a lot to unpack. So the way I'd start this question is let's go through the table and try and gather some information here. So first thing that I'm going to look at is absenteeism, 30% decrease. This is generally like considered a good thing, I guess, because as a business owner, you don't want your employees to be not showing up to work. So I guess we have one positive to keep in mind, but let's go on to the next. So deliveries per driver has increased. So productivity has gone up, which could be a good thing as well. But then we've got the third thing, which is number of accidents, 100% increase. So that's definitely not great. So that's indicating to me that the human resource strategy they're going to be using is probably not a great one. And then we can see for the last option, worker satisfaction decreasing 15%. That's also probably not great. So now that we've got that in mind, let's go back and look at the options. So A, increase in work health and safety training. Well, obviously we can see number of accidents has 100% increased. So I'd say they're definitely not implementing that strategy. So let's rule out A. And then let's look at B, reduced use of staff performance reviews. Well, I think this one is a little bit of an irrelevant one. Like, wouldn't really relate to increased accidents. I wouldn't really say that would decrease worker satisfaction because I feel like staff would be more satisfied if they have an indication of how they're doing in the workplace. And it doesn't really have a root connection to any of the indicators here. So I'm going to rule that one out for now. Then we've got C, move from autocratic to democratic leadership style. So democratic leadership style, we'd expect that to have an increase in worker satisfaction as the employees probably feel more valued in the workplace because they can contribute to business decisions. So I'd say that's probably not going to be an option. So then let's look at D, move from a fixed salary to pay based on individual deliveries. Well, if we had this scenario, that means that the workers are probably going to be more inclined to work harder because the more that they work and the more deliveries they make, the more they're going to get paid. So, looking at the table, that makes sense that absenteeism has gone down because people are less inclined to not show up to work if they're not going to get paid for not making deliveries. And then if we look at the second indicator, deliveries per driver, well, obviously, if you're getting paid per individual delivery, you're going to be wanting to make more deliveries. So that checks out with the 25% increase. Then the number of accidents increasing 100%. Well, it would make sense if people are rushing to complete these deliveries because they're getting paid based on deliveries, more accidents would occur. So that also fits D. And then worker satisfaction would definitely decrease in relation to D because people are having to work harder to earn more money. They're probably stressed because accidents are increasing. They're having to really push themselves to pump out deliveries to get paid. So for that reason, I think D is the answer. It's definitely a complicated question because there's a lot going on, but I think if you rationally try and link each option to the indicators in the table, you'll get there eventually. So that's how I would approach this question. But yeah, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I agree with really trying to flesh out this question. I feel like a lot of the advice you get in business studies is to like rip through the multis as soon as possible and get started on the short answers. I feel like it's with these questions where you get the tables and you get all the statistics that students often tend to make the most mistakes.
Yeah.
So my advice would just be to slow down with these questions, read the table and try to understand the table on its own, and then try to link it to what you said, Emily. Then try to see if you can link it to all the options there and just eliminate as you go. But yeah, I think that was a great job. Yeah. Okay, so now we're moving on to 2024. My question, yay, or my year. We're working 23B, and we have a piano teacher, or sorry, a piano teaching business which guarantees highly qualified and experienced teachers is rapidly expanding across all states of Australia. How may economic factors influence customers choosing this business? Now, I think this question, it's our first short answer question of the toughest 10 today. I think this question is really good at showcasing how important it is for you to know your syllabus, because you have what is seemingly quite a vague question, economic factors. However, and as you know, economic factors show up in every single influence section of your four different finance, operations, marketing, etc. We have them all show up, but it's the specific wording of the question that we know that it is a marketing question. So it is factors influencing consumer choice is the explicit words that marketing uses when talking about their influences. So that's just a really great example of knowing your syllabus. That's probably my best advice for business studies. Know your syllabus. Anyway, if we move on from there, I think our second step is to know what economic factors exist, or really know the definition of what economic factors are. So I would define it as, I know with influences on marketing, sometimes this can change between different schools and etc. But I was taught that it just refers to the boom and recession in an economic cycle, and it just sort of means consumers' willingness to spend. That's how I understand it. And so once you have that definition, or I should say before we get into the question a little bit more, if you're struggling like me, like business took a while for me to click. Like it just took a minute. I find it's really nice at the beginning of your answer to just define what the syllabus term means at the beginning. So you, before you start your answer, you say economic factors influencing consumer choice refers to blah 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 blah. Insert your definition there. And I find that's just a really good way to sort of get yourself going, to get, pen to paper, because sometimes I used to tend to freeze up at the beginning and not know what to write. But anyway, once we've done that, or once we've understood that, our third and final step is to really integrate the business example within your answer. It's not good enough in a band 6 to just give economic factors, and even doing like a cause and effect isn't really good enough if you're not explicitly talking about the business throughout the whole question. So what you need to do is find ways to integrate the business example within your answer. So you could say, during a boom, like say income levels, during a boom, like people experience higher levels of disposable income, which may increase influence of customers choosing this business. While this may be sort of vague, me just referring to this business, it does tick off that for the markers that you are actually interacting with this specific piano teaching business. So you wouldn't just say something like it may increase influence or customers' choice. You know what I mean? Be very specific. And anyway, another example would be, say, with a boom, you could say there's a general increase in consumer spending, which means consumers are more likely to purchase non-essential goods, such as high-quality piano lessons. Me including that high-quality piano lessons, I think really secures me in that band 6 range, because I thoroughly know what an economic factor is, and I have included the business in my example. But yeah, that's just personally how I'd answer. I know people do a few other different ways. Emily, would you do this any differently, or?
I think I would do it the same way. I think it's really important how you said it's a great way to start off your short answer responses with just quickly defining what economic factors are. Like, definitely in my high school, they taught me the same way, just kind of define the main general term that's in the question. And also, I found that when I was doing like practice papers and through my trials, my main feedback in the short answers was try and interact with the question a little bit more and draw out implications for the individual business. Because I find that often a lot of students are really good for doing that for the business report and they're really good at interacting with that question. But like with this question, when we have just like a one sentence description, I think students often overlook the fact that you should try and interact with the question more and mention the business. And like you said, it doesn't have to be anything crazy. Just linking to the highly qualified like teachers is a great way to interact with it. So yeah, I think that's an important takeaway, like you mentioned. Okay, so let's get to the seventh hardest question. This is from the 2015 paper. It's question 25B, and it's from the human resources and finance topic. So, getting a little bit more complicated now. So, we're given another massive table, which automatically makes this question a little bit daunting. It says the table contains data about a business in 2014 and 2015. Use the information in the table to answer part A and B. So we're just going to look at B, which is using the data, analyze the interdependence between human resources management and profitability management in this business, sorry. So I think straight away, again, this is really showing us the importance of being really familiar with our syllabus for business studies, because independence between human resources and other business functions is like a key part of the HR topic. And then you also visit it again when you're doing finance and you're doing interdependence between finance and the other business functions. So I feel like automatically, if you're on top of your syllabus, that makes this one a little bit easier. But the reason why I think this one is a little bit harder is because I guess it's kind of less common for them to ask you how HR and finance relate. I feel like they usually ask you about like operations and finance because there's more of a tangible link there. And also, we have to use so much data, which I feel like is quite intimidating because we've got a huge table here and we're not really sure to where to begin. But I think our starting point is going to be comparing the 2014 data to the 2015 data. So we can see from 2014 to 2015, absenteeism has increased, accidents have increased, strike days have decreased, the number of spending on training per employee has decreased. So I think that's kind of automatically showing a link between HR and finance there. Staff turnover has decreased, which is good. Fixed costs have decreased, and then the expenses ratio has decreased. So after we've gone through all of that, I feel like the relationship I can draw out here is that they're spending less money on their HR in terms of the training so that they can try and increase their profitability a little bit. As you can see that the expense ratio has changed from 20% to 10%. So, what I would say is your answer should probably start by explaining that HR decisions by HR managers, such as those regarding like training and retention, as we can see in the table, they directly impact profitability outcomes for the business. So, it's not really enough to just say they're interdependent on each other. I think it's really helpful to draw that link between saying like, the money that managers spend on training and retention have a direct impact on profitability. So, what you could say was for this business specifically, whilst they have decreased training expenditure, which could reduce their fixed costs, it has resulted in accidents to increase because employees aren't as skilled, which could also have a negative impact on finance because if accidents are increasing, they're probably going to have some costs associated with that. But yeah, that's just some like starting points that I would talk about. But I think it's really important to not just give like a vague definition of independence. I think you should really try and interact with the table here, because ultimately the question is asking you for this specific business. So yeah.
Yeah. I agree with that. And I think just some really important tips with interdependence is that I say, like, I would like to break this down. If I were to answer this question, I would break it down like 3 marks for each. Yeah, 3 marks each. And I'd say, I'd essentially go, how does HR management impact the finance? And then how does finance impact HR? A lot of students, when they see these tables, they tend to just pick one. They say, oh, HR influence profitability. Like, and that's it. But interdependence requires you to talk about how both impact the other, hence why they're interdependent. And another thing, when you're writing these, if you see a table in the HSC in your short answer, you need to be including the numbers themselves. It's not really, I don't think you'll get a band 6 if you just say increase or decrease. You need to be using 10 days has increased to 18 days in absenteeism. Using the actual numbers, I think, can get you a long way in making your answer look a lot more sophisticated. But yeah, that was good.
Okay, so we're going to get to a more difficult question now. Let's see.
Okay, so we're doing the 2013 question 24B. So, an Australian owned business manufactures bicycles in China and sells them to wholesalers in France. These wholesalers do not pay in advance. How could this business protect itself against a change in value of the Australian dollar relative to another currency? So obviously we're working in finance and we're actually going to be working, a lot of people may mistake this and think that they're working with exchange rates since we're talking about the value of an Australian dollar, but we're actually going to be talking about hedging in derivatives. So we have to know what hedging is. Hedging is essentially just the concept of a business protecting itself against fluctuating exchange rates overseas. And derivatives are essentially the ways in which they can do that. So we have to know our derivatives to begin with. So I think with derivatives, I think for this question, you can really pick any of them, and which is a forward exchange contract, options contract, and a swap contract. They tend to be pretty similar in the business syllabus, so I wouldn't stress too much about which one to pick. But essentially, I personally just like to go with the forward exchange contract. That's just the most simple, and I feel like you can integrate, you can integrate the stimulus well. But essentially, what you need to do is you need to define what your chosen contract is. So for me, a forward exchange contract, it's just a contract to exchange one currency for another at an agreed exchange rate on a future date, usually a period of 30, 90, or 180 days. But also, remember, we still have to integrate our stimulus or our business into our question. So once we've defined it, we can sort of work our way in, as I previously discussed. So we could say the forward exchange contract ensures that even if the Australian dollar appreciates or depreciates before the French wholesalers pay, the business will still receive a predictable amount in AUD. Now, this bit matters is, yes, they're protecting themselves, but I think a band 6 requires you to go a little bit beyond just giving that general, like, oh, they don't have to pay against a fluctuating exchange rate. The purpose of a forward exchange contract is to be predictable. That's essentially what they want. They want predictability in their business plans. So you could just add a little sentence after that saying, oh, using a forward exchange contract allows the business to have more controlled planning, monitoring, and controlling, which will allow them to stay liquid and to stay solvent. Something like that, I think, can really push you into that band 6 range. But again, that's everyone does it differently. But do you have anything else to add though?
I think no, I think you've covered it pretty well. I think it's a good point, like you said. In business studies, generally, like the derivatives are quite similar and they're quite basic. I know a lot of students, especially myself, kind of struggled with wrapping my head around like forwards and swaps and stuff. So I think if you kind of just have a really solid idea of one, like you said, forwards, you can probably apply it to pretty much any question they give you about hedging. Because, yeah, in business studies, it is like quite a basic level. They don't require you to go super in depth. But again, this kind of goes back to exchange rates before. Like they always are kind of difficult questions. So I'd say revise that. And as well, I think we're kind of, as we go through these toughest 10, we kind of realize in business studies to get a band 6, whilst it's super important to know your syllabus, you kind of can't just say, okay, this is what a forward exchange contract is. You kind of have to apply it to the business. So I think that's the difference between like a band 4 or 5 and a band 6. So I think we're established that now. But we're going to get to some of the harder questions because we're coming up to the 5th hardest question. So let's take a look. It is from 2023 paper, which was my HSC. This is question 2022C, and it's from the HR topic, and we've got another table again. So as we can see, this is a common theme in business studies. They're going to be giving you tables, and you're going to be having to draw some insights out. So let's see what it says. It says the table shows labour force participation rates for males and females in Australia 1981 to 2021. We've got the year, then we have participation for males and females. And then it says explain the social influences that have contributed to the changing labour force participation rates in the period of 1981 to 2021. So the reason why I thought this question was like a little bit tough is because it sort of expects you to go beyond just the basic syllabus knowledge. You sort of have to both draw out insights from the data and then kind of real world social history and social influences. So I think, again, that is part of the HR syllabus. It's literally a dot point social influences. So it's kind of a common theme here that if you know your syllabus well, you can tackle pretty much any question. And I think a great thing about the business studies syllabus is like the subpoints are often literally just the answer. So I think if you memorize your syllabus, you'll be able to tackle any question pretty well. But let's take a look at this question. So again, like we've been saying, my first step is to immediately look at the table and try and draw out some insights. So obviously, the most dramatic change I can see is that female participation has gone up greatly. So from 1981, it was 44%, and then to 2021, it was 62%. And then males has slightly decreased from 78% to 71%. So now let's try and think of some social influences that would have contributed to these changes. I would say the biggest one is probably women having more access to education. So you could start with that. But then the other thing, I would talk about some like economic factors and the changing of like the household. So now in our current society, we often have two people working in the household, whereas in like the 80s and the 70s, it was often the male. But since like in our current economic state, the cost of living is so high, we now have dual income households. So that has resulted in more women working. And then also some social influences we have are like things like sort of from the government and policy, like paid parental leave, and also the rise of flexible work has made it more accessible for women to enter the workforce. So that's kind of tackling why female participation has gone up. But then I think it's also insightful to kind of slightly draw on why the male participation has gone down, even though it is marginally less. I still think it's important for a band 6 answer to kind of show that you're well rounded and you're really interacting with the data. So I would say as well, there's probably more of a lifestyle shift where young men aren't really heading straight from school to the workplace. There's more of a value of education in the current society. So it's kind of a lifestyle shift where people are pursuing education first and they aren't directly going into the workforce. So I think that is has resulted in this slight decline. And then I'm not really sure how you could tie this into social factors, but you probably could. But just the decline in traditional jobs like manufacturing and stuff that were strongly male dominated have sort of died in Australia. So I think that's also sort of had an impact on the male participation. But yeah, I think there's quite a lot you can talk about in respect to the syllabus. So, like I said, if you've memorized the syllabus, you can easily draw out a few points. I think the most important part is just to really interact with that table and actually physically say, okay, it went from 44% to 62%, because then you're interacting more with the question and you're kind of showing that you understand beyond the syllabus and you're able to apply what you learned in the syllabus to each question. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think what makes this question like the toughest 10, it's not necessarily difficult in asking what social influences is, but it's 5 marks and it's got a table. So you really do, I agree, the difficulty in this question is thinking beyond the syllabus, the syllabus, and being able to make real world connections with the syllabus, if that makes sense. And I
Yeah.
think that's just something you'll get with practice over time. Like, don't be stressed if, right now, I don't know if you've even done HR yet in some of your schools, but don't be too stressed. If you can't answer this, just keep answering these really difficult specific ones. And then you'll find as you can create links from the actual world and other parts of the syllabus, that's just a skill you have to develop. But yeah.
Okay, let's look at the next question.
Number 4, the fourth hardest question, we have the 2023 question 21C. And we have an Australian tire manufacturer is expanding its business in order to reduce operating costs and increase sales and profit. Rubber will be sourced from the global market. The business wants to maintain quality outputs and achieve economies of scale. The owner of the tire manufacturing business has purchased leading-edge technology to help achieve economies of scale. Explain why both staff and management might be resistant to this change. And it's for 5 marks. I think the trouble with this question is there is a lot of information thrown at you, and it isn't even in a business report. Like you look at this and you're like, oh, it's a business report. No, it's not. It's 5 marks. Anyway, okay. I think the easiest thing, I think we just start, let's just start with the question. The business wants to maintain quality outputs and achieve economies of scale. Cool. That's not really something that answers the question quite well yet. So we'll just keep moving on. And I think the most important thing about this question is they've purchased leading edge technology to help achieve economies of scale. If you know your syllabus well, which I hope we've emphasized enough by now, is leading edge technology is an operations strategy. And I think with any operations strategy, what really puts you to have a competitive advantage against all your other classmates is to essentially, or what I did is, the definition and you just have a few little dot points of advantages and disadvantages. I think that really puts you, if you know that, like maybe 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages about leading edge technology, like you're out of band 6, like don't worry. But anyway, this question actually isn't even asking about leading edge technology. It's about our resistance to change, which is also in the operations strategies at the very end. We just have resistance to change. And if you know your syllabus, you should know all 5 or 6 of them. But anyway, personally, what I would do is break this question into two sections. It's 5 marks. Spend, I think, the first mark or 2 defining leading edge technology and defining what resistance to change is. And then I'd spend the 2 marks describing staff resistance to change and management resistance to change. I think it's quite interesting. They usually when they talk about resistance to change, it's just management. And I think the syllabus reflects that as well. They talk about redundancy payments, not redundancy. But anyway, so I think staff's an interesting one to work with, but I think it's also kind of gives you an edge because I think about resistance to change. I think a lot about the staff as well. But anyway, So you could essentially, within your resistance to change syllabus, which is a lot, you can actually kind of pick anything. I think with most resistance to change questions, they do give you quite a broad scope in what you can pick, and a lot of the res- resistances to change tend to be quite similar to each other or interlinked. So, say for leading edge technology, we know leading edge technology is like really, really expensive. Think Apple, think like Amazon with their like robot warehouses. We know that it's really expensive. And so management is going to be resistant to this change because of financial costs. So if I can, financial costs is one of the resistance to change in the syllabus. Tick, yay. It can have a significant impact on short term finance and could lead to issues with liquidity. That's okay. That's me linking finance. That's going a little bit beyond the 5 marks there. But obviously they will be resistant to this, but ultimately they're using leading edge technology to maintain quality outputs whilst achieving economies of scale. So yes, it will have a significant impact on short term finance, but it's ultimately for the longer goal of achieving economies of scale. But also, management may also be resistant to change due to redundancy payments. And so, redundancy payments can be really expensive. And with leading edge technology, that tends to actually eradicate just people's roles or a lot of the time. And redundancy payments are mandatory and very expensive. So, obviously, management may be a little hesitant to adopt leading edge technology. So, we've done those two. Awesome. Now we can move on to staff. And staff may be resistant to retraining. And so, as leading edge technology often replaces human labor, it also requires a lot of new training to be able to understand and to function in a business. And staff may be hesitant in adjusting to these new processes, especially if they've worked there for a really long time, anything like that. And also, staff may experience a bit of inertia. So, if you don't know what inertia is, that's just essentially like a lack of motivation or willingness to change. And I would say this is due to significant process changes, is if they're adopting this leading edge technology and a lot of people are becoming redundant, then the staff that remain are going to be a little hesitant. They're going to be a little I don't want to say fearful, but they're going to have a little lack of motivation going on. So yeah. So what I've done as I've gone through those 4 points in management and in staff, I've connected it to the business. So remember, we're constantly connecting it to leading edge technology, we're connecting it to the business, and we're getting that 5 out of 5 that we deserve. But yeah, is there anything else to add that you'd like to say or
No, I think you've covered it perfectly. I really liked how you mentioned they are actually just explicitly mentioned in the syllabus, like the resistance to changes. I found that for me, especially when it came to like influences for each of the four topics, I just pick like, okay, I'm going to remember globalization and technology and then some other ones. So I can write a perfect response for that instead of memorizing every single one. Like, I feel like for this question, if you came into the HSC and you were like, okay, for resistance to change, I have a great answer for financial costs and inertia and redundancy payments, you'd probably be like super set for a question like this. And really, all you needed to do was just remember those dot points in the syllabus, and then you can just expand on that. So I think that's a good tip for business because usually they give you quite a broad leeway of like being able to go into whichever like sub dot point you want. As long as you know like the main ones, I think you can confidently answer pretty much any question, which we've seen here.
yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, I
now we're
agree.
gonna get to the third hardest question. So it's getting tough now, guys, but don't worry, we're gonna tackle this one. It's 2021, question 22 from the finance topic. And I don't know about you, but I always thought finance was probably the toughest topic in business studies. So it's a common theme here. So let's see what it says. It says a luxury Australian handbag business is going to expand. They intend to borrow 30 million US dollars to buy several new retail properties across Australia. And then for A, we're asked to identify where the business could record the loan and the properties on its balance sheet. And then B, explain a financial risk associated with borrowing funds from the USA. So I think this question is difficult because it's testing like two of the harder concepts in the finance syllabus. So we've got balance sheet like classifications and then global financial risk. And then that's particularly exchange rates for B, which we've sort of already visited in the toughest 10. So hopefully you guys are getting a bit more confident with that. But for tackling part A, where they could record the loan and properties on the balance sheet. I think first, let's classify if this is an asset or a liability. Well, since they're borrowing $30 million, that's going to be a liability because liabilities are what you owe and assets are what you own. So I think that's a good way to try and remember it. And then we have to establish, is this a non-current or a current liability? Well, if we think of like the word itself, current is going to be in this time period, so under a year. But if they're borrowing $30 million to buy several properties, I'm going to say that this is a non-current liability because it's long-term debt. Because properties usually require a mortgage, which is like 30 years. So, based on those two factors, I would record the loan and the properties as a non current liability, and then the properties would be a non current asset. Hopefully, that made sense, but you know what I mean.
Oh, I got it. Yeah, I
Okay.
got it.
So, B, explain a financial risk associated with borrowing funds from the USA. I think this is the kind of the tougher one out of the two. As we've already discussed briefly at the start of our toughest 10 here, borrowing in from the US, so you're borrowing US dollars, that is going to automatically open you up to exchange risk. So you have the risk here that if the value of the Australian dollar changes, the value of how much you have in US dollars also changes. So it's kind of hard for like students to wrap their head around. So that's what I was saying at the start. If we have a really strong grasp of what appreciations and depreciations in the exchange rate entail, I think you're going to be more confident tackling these types of questions. But fundamentally, borrowing funds from the US is risky because the value of our Australian dollar can change. So if the Australian dollar drops, that means that the Australian dollar is weaker. So one Australian dollar buys less of US money. So say this $30 million loan, you have this loan and then the Australian dollar drops, suddenly it's going to cost even more to pay off this $30 million loan. So that is the financial risk that I would talk about here, which is exchange rate risk. And I think that's one of the major ones for global financial management. I think it's the best and easiest to talk about. So since it's a 3 marker, I would quickly explain what exchange risk was. So that's just the risk that occurs due to changes in exchange rates. And then you would just say if the Australian dollar depreciated, the cost of borrowing the $30 million funds from the US would increase, and they'd probably have to pay back more than they initially expected and budgeted from because of the currency changes, even if their business in Australia is doing fine. And that would have like overall impacts on their profitability because they're having to spend more money, and that could like also influence them because they're trying to expand. So if they have less capital, maybe their expansion won't go as well. But yeah, I think once you break it down this question, it's a little bit simpler, but definitely exchange rates and like global financial management is always a bit of a tough one. So yeah.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think my tip for this one, guys, as Emily said, once you've broken this down, it's not that hard. You just really have to know. And I think finance is the most like difficult one to really pat down your knowledge on. But just study finance. I know no one wants to because it's hard, But you will do so much better and you'll be so much more confident in yourself if you can easily identify or know your balance or know all your different types of sheets, like the income sheet, balance sheet, etc., and know your financial risks. I think this is more a matter of content personally than it is perhaps than being able to apply. I think this is where it probably
Yep.
becomes the toughest 10 just because financial risk is oddly specific, a part of the processes, I think. But yeah, this one is tough. So try to give this one a go and other finance ones a go and see how you go at that. But yeah, that's all I have to add with this one.
Okay, should we get to the second toughest question?
I think we're ready. Yeah. Okay. We have the 2018 question 26. It's operations and marketing. Explain the influence of global markets on financial management of businesses. This one's tough. If I saw this in my HSC, I'm just gonna put the pen down, honestly. But that's okay, because you won't do that in your own HSC. And the good thing about this question is that it's already been asked, so don't worry about it too much. Sorry, I said it was operations and marketing. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. It's just finance. Sorry, that was my error. Anyway, let's get into this question. Actually, let's get into tips for doing a case study. Because personally, I was actually quite good at case studies. I'm not that good at business reports, but like case studies I was actually pretty good at them, not to flex. But yeah, so with your case studies, I think personally, or the way the HSC goes, is you have the two options, obviously, or I hope you know by now. You have an easier one and a harder one. That's how the HSC tends to go in writing these. This is definitely the harder one. Try to just do the easier one if you can. Because, yes, you're doing the harder one, and perhaps the markers will respect that. But personally, I always think it's better to knock the easier one out of the park, like 20 out of 20, than it is to sort of fumble around with the harder one and say that you kind of answer the question, but because it's a harder one, you get marked better on it. That's not really true. Anyway, so the actual question itself, explain. So, yay, that's a pretty easy one. You don't have to evaluate or use any criteria, etc. Explain is just that as a result, it's the cause and effect. And we need to know how or what the influences of global markets are and essentially their effect on financial management of businesses. Now, of course, you have to know your syllabus for this one, unfortunately. So, the way I would go about this is with finance, this is like an influence question, and the subheading for, or like the sub dot points for global market influences are economic outlook, availability of funds, and interest rates. So I would make a paragraph for each of those. So yeah, one paragraph for each dot point. That would be the easiest way if I did it, because personally, in 2024, I would not be able to answer this question. So this is a raw sort of. So this is how I would do it if I got this in the HSC. I would make it into those three. So boom, I think that already elevates you there because you're telling the markers, hey, I still know the syllabus, even though this is kind of a tricky question. So essentially, what I like to do with these is I think I have a very specific structure in doing mine. Oh, and before I get into the structure about the case studies, I like to have a different business for each paragraph. My favorites were Apple, Amazon, Qantas. Sometimes I actually just made a business up, and that works too if you're getting really desperate and you don't really know what to talk about. I did that in my trials and I got a 20 out of 20 on my case study, so take that as you will. I don't know if your schools will accept that. But anyway, feel free to either do 3 businesses or just one. Personally, I like 3, just so you know a little bit more broadly about business studies in general. But anyway, so what I like to do with my structure for these paragraphs, and I feel like this is a pretty good structure, is one, you have to have an opening sentence, obviously. Sometimes, even with these explain ones, I would simply just answer them like it was an assess or an evaluate, just because I found that the most easy. Or I'd say I'd open it with something like, what would I say? I'd say, the economic outlook is an influence on global markets that has had a variety of impacts on financial management of businesses. And that would be my opening for economic outlooks. And then with my structure, I'd have that opening sentence, I would define it, and then something I would like to, and then I'd sort of explain a little bit about the influence on global markets and specifically with my business, how my business was involved with that. Like, say for Amazon, I like to do it a lot about Amazon. So I would say something like Amazon has recently responded to changes in global economic outlook post COVID. So I'm not just defining and explaining what economic outlook is. I'm being really specific. Here is a specific period in time about an economic outlook, and here is how my business, Amazon, has responded to it. So, doing that. And one thing that I really think put me in a band six response for the case studies was my sort of about my the way I worked with my criteria. So essentially, I'll explain it here. And I like to say something like the effect of, the influence of economic outlook on financial businesses can be seen in, and I would pick two of the financial objectives. Or if this were an operations thing, I'd pick two of the operations objectives, two of the HR, etc. So I could say could be seen in liquidity and could be seen in, I don't know, solvency. I'd say something like that, or efficiency. It could be any of them. And then I go and I define what both of them mean. And then for the rest of the paragraph, I would break down how the financial management has changed or how their liquidity has been essentially influenced by economic outlook, and how their efficiency has been influenced by economic outlook. And I think giving those really specific details on how the business has been affected with the criteria, I think really put me in that band six response, I believe. But anyway, sorry, I'm talking a lot about economic outlook here. Essentially, when you're talking about your case studies, your case study, or at least for me, I liked it to be all about the business. So I would be giving like specific, like, oh, in 2019, Amazon did XYZ. After post COVID, Amazon had adapted to using ABC, and this affected their liquidity by blah, blah, blah percent. Using those really specific dates and those really specific statistics is what's going to actually put you uh, or give you a little bit of an edge with these. Like, I truly believe writing as much statistics as you can and really going back to the criteria and seeing how your business performs within the criteria based on how they've been affected by influences is what is going to put you at a band six response. But yeah, essentially, I think we've kind of got the structure down. I just do the exact same thing, but for availability of funds and interest rates. And I hope you know your syllabus well, but also this question really challenges you to know your content well, because you can't really hide from not knowing your content in a case study. So I think this is a very important example of you actually have to know the definitions of economic outlook, availability of funds, and interest rates within these, and knowing a little bit about them. So yeah, but that is just my tip for the case study. Everyone does case studies differently, by the way. Some people put a little bit of information about a business and a whole lot of information about the syllabus dot point. But yeah, that's just the way I do it. I think it's a pretty surefire way of a band six, but that's just me. But Emily, would you do it any differently, or?
Yeah, I did it the same way. I did three paragraphs and then one business per paragraph. I think, like you said, that's more way to show some more diversity in of your knowledge. And as well, I kind of focused it a little bit more on the business and how that demonstrated what we learn in the syllabus rather than having a more syllabus based approach. I just thought that was more useful because it kind of shows how you can apply some real world insight, which I think is what they're looking for in the case studies. But yeah, I think you tackled it pretty much the same way that I would. So, do we want to get to the
I think we should.
toughest
I think we should.
question?
I think we're ready.
Oh, here it is. I already put it up. It is from the 2022 paper, question 19. So it's the business report, 20 marker, and it combines operations, finance, and HR. So literally nearly every topic except marketing. But let's take a look. It says Aussie Baby Food Pty Ltd have developed a trusted reputation in domestic and global markets due to their safe and sustainably sourced product range. This has led to a significant increase in demand. As a result, they are considering the purchase of a larger automated factory. This will lead to some job losses. The business will require external finance to fund the factory purchase using either a mortgage or becoming a public company on the Australian Securities Exchange. You have been hired as a consultant by Aussie Baby Food to write a business report to the owners. So, in our report, we're asked to one, outline 2 operations influences affecting this business. Then we're asked to discuss the use of retraining and redundancy payments to help overcome employee resistance to these changes. And then lastly, we're asked to compare the use of a mortgage to a new issue of shares to fund the factory purchase. Now, I feel like this question is definitely the toughest because it's kind of all over the place. Like, we're going from operations influences to then mortgage and redundancy pay. Like, it's so much going on. And I feel like if I got this question in the HSC, I would be like, where is the link between these 3 questions? Like, it's crazy. But the thing is, for the business report, I think you kind of have to show that link between your 3 dot points whilst continually referring back to the scenario. So I think that's why this question is a little bit tough, because it's not kind of obvious how they interact. But I think the easiest way is to kind of take a look at the stimulus we've got here and then approach each question separately. So I don't know about you, but the way I did my business report is I just have an executive summary, and then I would answer each of the 3 separately. But I know some people like to do an executive summary and an intro. Personally, I just had executive summary because I think you should have more information in your body paragraphs than kind of spending that time writing an introduction.
Yeah.
So for outlining 2 operation influences affecting this business, I think the easiest ones that we can draw out here are technology and sustainability. And that's just me drawing them out from the actual scenario here. So we can see here that for sustainability, they've developed a trusted reputation because of their safe and sustainably sourced product range. So I think that's definitely one of the operations influences on this business. And you're just asked to outline, so that's sketch in general terms. So you're just going to have to give like a brief overview of what sustainability is in regards to operations. So that's just using like recycled materials and stuff. And then the second one I would say is technology. And that's because in the actual scenario, it says they're considering purchasing a larger automated factory. So to get that band 6, I would say explicitly reference the scenario there. And then the way I'd say that influence is obviously things like economies of scale, like you can produce outputs faster, it increases efficiency, and as well, that can also give you like a competitive advantage because you're producing more efficiently. So I think that one's all right. It's like pretty manageable. And then for discuss the use of retraining and redundancy payments to help overcome employee resistance to these changes. That one I think is kind of explicitly related to actually our first dot point here, which is influences affecting this business, because it relates to the technology. So I think it's kind of useful if you can establish that link there. But what I said is like retraining kind of helps employees feel supported. And like we were talking about before in that previous question with inertia, and sort of reduces the fear that they won't be able to use this new technology, and it kind of helps them feel like supported and encourages them to be less resistant, because if they feel confident that they can use it, they're probably more likely to adapt to the technology. And then redundancy payments, well, obviously, as we said before, they're actually a legal obligation, so they must be used to help employees overcome these changes. And for the employees who do lose their jobs due to the implementation of this automated technology, that's just going to make the transition a lot smoother, and it's going to help the business obviously practice more ethically and legally responsibly. So just, yeah, that's how I'd approach that. And then for the last one, I think this is the hardest, which is compare the use of a mortgage to a new issue of shares to fund the factory purchase. Because I feel like, again, finance is the hardest topic, and I don't think we really touch on like comparing a mortgage to an issue of shares. So I think that's how this one gets a little bit tricky. But it says that they need external finance, so they don't have a lot of funds already, I guess we can assume. But the main thing that I sort of compare mortgage and issues of shares is that the main advantage of a mortgage is you keep ownership, you have 100% ownership rights compared to the issue of shares, but then it's going to add a debt liability and interest, which could have an impact on the overall profitability and liquidity, because if you're making interest repayments, that's reducing the amount of cash you have at hand because it's being allocated to these interest repayments and debt repayments. And then for the issues of shares, it's kind of the inverse. So it raises money without the need of a liability, but then it dilutes ownership. And then you might have issues with shareholders wanting to make decisions which you don't agree with as a business owner. So I personally would say, in this scenario, if you want control of the business, go with a mortgage. Or if you want more flexibility and greater access to capital, go with the issue of new shares. But yeah, the two main comparison I would make is mortgage helps you maintain that ownership, but it adds debt liability. And then issue of shares, it gives you that money without the need to repay, but it dilutes ownership. So, yeah, it's kind of a complicated question, but hopefully that makes sense. I think in your actual business report, you'll flesh it out a bit more. But the most important part is to keep linking back to the stimulus there, which I think we've tried to do. And I think it's important to try and kind of maintain a link and logical flow between the three dot points they're asking you there. But hopefully you guys understand this question now. And if you do, I think you could probably answer any question if you could answer this one.
Yeah, definitely. I think my advice for business reports is, to begin with, I was never good at business reports. Like, business studies as a whole subject was like my underdog subject. I failed my first business report that I ever did for prelim. And then I ended up getting a 20 out of 20 on the trials, guys. So believe me, you can make it. If I can make it happen, you can make it happen. With what you said earlier about fleshing it out, that was my biggest issue. I didn't know how to flesh things out. Maybe I'd write maybe 2 lines for an operations influence, be like, I'm done. Like, this is all I have to say. If you're struggling to flesh things out, what I said before in the case study is think back to your objectives for each business function and I think this is helpful. Think how, or say for the first question about operations influences, think how speed might be impacted by these, think how quality might be impacted, think how the rest of them, cost, all those sorts of things. If you can link your influences or any syllabus dot point to how it may impact or how it may be impacted by your key business functions, I thought that was really helpful for me because, one, you can link it to any business, and also it really helps you make those bigger connections and be able to expand more on your business reports. But yeah, for business reports, if you struggle with them, try to do as many as possible. That's for me. I didn't do any short answers when I studied because I was so bad at business reports. I was like, this is essentially just one really long short answer. So if you're like me and you really used to struggle with them, or you still do, just write them. Write the whole thing. Don't even do the dot points. Like, forget 1984, forget the rest of them. Focus on your business reports because they really like make or break your HSC, I think, your business studies. But yeah, that is my advice for business studies and for the business reports. So yeah.
Okay, well, we've gone through the toughest 10 questions. I think after we've gone through it, it's like, okay, if you're really on top of your syllabus and you know everything, it's not that bad. You can always find a way to answer the question, but I hope this was useful for you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for watching. We hope this is really helpful, and yeah, the main takeaway, just know your syllabus before trials. You can fill in the rest later. But yeah, thank you so much, guys, for watching. And, feel free to check out all of our other resources and Excel HSC Copilot. But yeah, thank you. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.